Bitcoin gives us totally new things you can do with it. Like you can do multi-sig custody and split your keys on multiple jurisdictions so that even technically a nation state has trouble getting to it in any sort of direct sense. Whereas with gold, and this is really any real world assets, even if you put something like a blockchain on top of it, it's still tied to where's the actual custodian held, what is the legal chain that works there. The fundamental shift is fast settlement. That's the new breakthrough. So it's not just another layer on top of that. So telegraph, telephone, radio, and internet were all just kind of faster and faster, whereas this actually brings up the bottom quicker for the first time. That's the fundamental difference. While governments will, in most cases, in most regions, still exist in various capacities, they have less of just a full control over everything.
In this powerful conversation, Lyn Alden explores how Bitcoin represents a fundamental leap in the history of human communication, comparing it to revolutions like the telegraph, telephone, and internet. But unlike those technologies, Bitcoin introduces something entirely new: fast, final settlement of value, with no need to trust intermediaries. She explains how this changes the game for governments, financial systems, and individuals alike, disrupting central bank control, stripping away seigniorage, and offering people around the world a way to opt out of inflationary fiat regimes. From the failure of gold-backed systems to the global game theory playing out among nation-states, Lyn breaks down how Bitcoin's trustless architecture and multi-sig security make it the most credible path forward. She also unpacks the deep implications this has on future governance, capital markets, and how society may reorganize in a post-fiat world. Stick around until the end to hear how Bitcoin could make governments more local, taxes more transparent, and sovereignty more accessible to everyone. Also guys, if you like our cryptocurrency content, please remember to like and subscribe to stay up to date. Now, over to Lyn.
So I think it's by far the best shot we have. I always hesitate to say that it's like inevitable, but basically it's the most credible way we have to get past this period of centralization. So for about 150 years, we've been in the period where, going back to my prior point, transaction speeds were speed of light, physical settlement was still slow. We finally invented fast settlement. Satoshi and all his predecessors finally figured out fast settlement. And then, we're kind of watching that catch on. It has to go through the massive network effect. It's up against the $100 trillion network effect of the dollar, the multi-$100 trillion network effect of fiat currencies globally, the whole global bond market, and all the governments tied to it. So this little open source thing is kind of doing this multi-decade path through this very entrenched system. It's gradually succeeding. It has things to navigate. It had to, navigate big countries trying to ban it and then figuring out they kind of can't ban it. And, politicians realizing that there's nothing to gain really from donors or anyone else, from voters, for being anti-Bitcoin, but there is a lot to gain from being pro-Bitcoin. And so it's kind of going through that game theory over time. There's a couple countries that are ahead of the curve and say, well, if other countries are going to be slow and even anti, we're going to be the ones that embrace it. It still has to go through some challenges, like, if we do have, quantum computers, it's got to be able to make that change, and that has implications for signature types and potentially even block size issues with the length of those new signature types. So it has to navigate still, I think, some challenges ahead. But it's by far the best chance we have. And it's something that it's kind of fundamental. Like even if society were to rerun this whole modernization period multiple times, kind of like how the bicycle would always come before the car, would always come before the airplane, because basically you kind of have the predecessor stuff kind of built into it. We always would have Morse code before we have something like Bitcoin.
Sure.
And, Morse code could be called different. It could have a different, alphabet equivalent, but it still is basically Morse code. Right. Kind of like how Bitcoin wouldn't necessarily have the exact parameters it has now, but something like Bitcoin, if you get to this period, would eventually emerge. And I think it we want it to succeed on the first try rather than have to kind of start this project all over again.
Yes. Okay. So that's interesting. Perhaps the significance of it is that it is another step change in that telecommunications revolution. Although we're kind of pushing the telecommunications analogy somewhat, but money does serve as an economic telecommunications, right?
Yeah, I think the fundamental shift is fast settlement. That's the new breakthrough.
Yeah.
So it's not just another layer on top of that. So telegraph, telephone, radio, and internet were all just kind of faster and faster.
Yeah.
Whereas this actually brings up the bottom quicker for the first time. That's the fundamental difference.
And so it's fast final settlement.
Yes.
So the energy is moving as fast as the information.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
When I was debating Peter Schiff, this was like probably the crux of my argument. That you can't scale gold without promises. Do you agree with that? Is that in trying to like crystallize the argument of why Bitcoin over gold, is it that we can scale Bitcoin, I don't want to say without promises, but with a lot less reliance on promises? There's still going to be counterparties in capitalism and all that, so there's always going to be some counterparty risk. But we can do that in a counterparty risk minimized way, whereas we cannot scale gold in that way.
Yeah, I think that's the crux of it. And it's not to say that gold is now useless.
Yeah.
But much like how gold was kind of treated as the backstop for the equities and financial markets, I think in a digital world, gold's kind of the backstop. If people have, what about tail risks of everything going offline or something? People do like the physical aspect of having, say, gold in their house or whatever. So it's not to say that it's useless, but it doesn't serve that same purpose of really trust minimize money.
Yeah.
And even Bitcoin gives us totally new things you can do with it. Like you can do multi-sig custody and split your keys on multiple jurisdictions, so that even technically a nation state has trouble getting to it in any sort of direct sense.
Yeah.
Whereas with gold, and this is really any real world assets, even if you put something like a blockchain on top of it, it's still tied to where's the actual custodian held, what is the legal chain that works there.
The Oracle problem, right?
Yeah, and like for example, and people often say, well, why can't you make like a gold-backed crypto? And it's like, well, they've existed for years. There are gold stable coins. There's a market demand for them. It's not very big, but it exists. And I can imagine, for example, if you want to, have access to gold, but you're in an environment where it's hard to get physical gold, you can't get the gold ETF, you can at least get this, semi-trusted chain of custody to hold that gap for you. But it's opening the same problem that they ran into time and time again.
This has been like a game theoretic conundrum forever then, right? Like how do we exchange with one another in a way that we don't need to trust one? This is Nick Szabo's term, right? Trust minimization. Yeah. Why has it been, it seems like, I don't know, like there is no other solution than Bitcoin? Like, is there any, like, say, if we didn't have Bitcoin, would there have been another solution to this problem?
I think eventually something like Bitcoin would have been invented.
Okay.
It could have, there's certain arbitrary things that could have been, it could have had a 42 million supply cap, for example. It could have had 12-minute block times. Yeah. But I think something like it, and we saw that, bringing up Nick Szabo, there was this existing chain of people that were working on it. It goes back to David Chaum, at least. Yeah. Back in the 1980s, he literally, his dissertation at Berkeley was basically how can mutually distrusting groups operate a ledger. Yeah. That's basically what he was doing. Right. And then when you add things like, what Nick added to it, what Adam Back added to it, what Hal Finney added to it, they were all kind of putting these pieces together. And it got to the point where they had, Hal Finney had reusable proof of work tokens.
Yeah.
That's very close to Bitcoin. And they didn't quite crack the decentralization problem, which Satoshi ended up doing with the difficulty adjustment, which continues to be kind of an underrated aspect. They added a fairly straightforward control loop to make this system work. And basically what that does, it takes Fedwire. So Fedwire is this foundational ledger that banks tie into. And it basically says, well, we can have something like that, but we can have it open source and backed by proof of work and no single entity is in charge of it. And it's got fixed units instead of arbitrary units. And that's now a competition that exists. I think another way of putting it is it makes trust optional. Because even with something like Bitcoin, there are still scaling issues that sometimes custody solves. But for example, if you have $1,000 spending wallet versus, a $100,000 life savings wallet, you have two different security requirements for those types of things. And sometimes you want the speed and convenience. It's kind of like how, you might have money in your physical wallet you bring around with you. You prefer not to lose it, but it's not the end of the world if you do. And I think that basically what this whole open source stack does is it says we can now choose who we trust and under what circumstances we trust. Whereas the fiat system, there's no option. For Bitcoin, if you were operating in any sort of economic sense, you need a bank account. And every bank that exists by permission of the central bank and the governing body. And so you have this big closed source, fully centralized stack and trust was mandate. You had to
Yeah.
trust. And now at least you have the option to say, who do I trust and under what circumstances?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And you can't even opt out of that system. If you're fully paranoid in a fiat system and you're the guy that stashes all your cash under the mattress, you still have the counterparty risk of the central bank, right? Hyperinflating the currency, deauthorizing it, whatever they may do.
Well, and even things like, running a business, getting a paycheck as an employee. I mean, we see them when people are debanked. It makes hard to function in the modern society, and that's something that prior to Bitcoin there kind of was no answer to, and now there's an answer to it. And these systems aren't designed so that every single person is, say, fully sovereign for every transaction they ever do in their life, but they always have the option to kind of fall back into more self-sovereign aspects when they feel like they need to, or they always have that optionality.
Yeah, that's the big change, right? You can not be fully exposed to counterparties. Right?
Yeah.
You can be the full-blown actual crypto anarchist running Bitcoin and have basically zero counterparty risk if you operate it properly.
Yeah, you have total workarounds.
Yeah.
That didn't exist before.
Yeah,
that's huge.
Yeah, and then just to reiterate the point on a multi-key custody solution, that is so fascinating, right? That we now don't even have to trust a custodian, including whether that's ourselves or someone else. You can now split that up amongst custodians or yourself, your trusted loved ones, your accountant, your attorney, whoever. It's such a game changer.
Yeah, that's completely new for this entire asset.
Lyn Alden outlines how a world where Bitcoin succeeds could fundamentally change the way societies are structured. In many countries, like Egypt, where inflation is rampant, citizens have little way to opt out of currency debasement. Bitcoin changes that. With zero long-term supply growth and fast settlement, it challenges the ability of governments to quietly extract wealth through inflation. This forces a shift toward transparency. Historically, rulers, from Roman emperors to modern central banks, avoided direct taxation by debasing currency. But in a Bitcoin-based system, governments must tax openly to fund themselves. There's no hidden backdoor. As a result, power could decentralize. Regions might still choose more or less government, but people will know exactly what they're consenting to. In a sense, Bitcoin could make governance more local, more accountable, and far less reliant on opaque financial engineering. This transformation also weakens the grip of centralized financial institutions. When access to capital no longer depends on alignment with government-controlled banks or monetary policy, individuals and communities gain more autonomy. It means small businesses, dissidents, and citizens in authoritarian regimes can operate outside systems designed to exclude or control them. Over time, this shift could erode the monopoly of legacy financial systems and usher in a more open, pluralistic economic order, one where trust is earned, not enforced.
Let's assume Bitcoin succeeds and it does, on this mission of giving us the ideal money we talked about earlier, the decentralized spreadsheet in the sky that tracks favors that are rendered consensually and hopefully it's protected against coercive movements or modifications, let's say. How does that impact social organization more broadly? Does this start to lead us into a future that is more decentralized? If we decentralize the money successfully, how does that start to show up in society and social organization broadly?
I think
obviously you have to just guess here and speculate, but what do you think it looks at?
Yeah, so it starts with the assumption that Bitcoin gets massive and really starts to actually meaningfully displace currency and bond markets. That's basically the question. If you look at some of those older European maps, they'd be a lot more fractured than what it kind of consolidated into. And I think to some extent that kind of can reemerge in the sense that while governments will, in most cases, in most regions, still exist in various capacities, they have less of just a full control over everything. For example, the full banking system is currently under every country's control.
Yeah.
They can go around that. And they have a much harder prospect of raising capital. Because again, if Egyptians, going back to that point, 20 to 30% money supply growth is happening, and there's very few ways to opt out of it other than power users getting into Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And even people that have gold stashed away, they still have bank accounts. There's always still some residual stuff being just kind of opaquely taken from them by this seigniorage, this debasement. Yeah. And so it really just kind of closes the window of all these different issuers around the world for how much seigniorage they can get away with. because they're competing with not, before they were competing basically with gold,
Yeah.
or smaller countries are competing with the dollar. And so they're competing with something, if it's gold case, they're competing with something that grows at 2% a year and is really slow. If they're competing with the dollar, they're competing with something that grows at 7% a year but is pretty fast and usually gives you a yield that gives you some of that 7% back. Whereas now they're competing with Bitcoin that has zero long-term supply growth and is basically as fast as the dollar. And that's a much harder competition to go against. So I think that it to the extent that Bitcoin gets another 10x or notably bigger from here and really kind of eats into fiat currency markets more, it really reduces the ability of all these different entities around the world to capture that scale of seigniorage.
Yeah, and then so that means less revenue for the centralized state. And then so does Bitcoin make government local again? Is that the direction we're headed?
It might. I think that the more conservative thing I would say is that it makes it more transparent in the sense that there might still be communities that want more government or want less government.
Yeah.
But at least they generally know what they're getting into. It's like they're saying, like, part of why we run, like my talk here was called Nothing Stops This Train. I was talking about the fiscal deficits. It's because we can't agree on how we're going to balance things. So this error just keeps spilling out as we fail to agree with each other. And in a Bitcoinized world, that can't really happen. There, like, defaults happen before that just runs forever. Yeah. And so basically it says, well, we can still pay for this, but we actually have to tax for it. And so, and taxes are transparent. That's why if you go back to wars in the past, that's why even like older emperors and kings would debase their coinage, because it was a way to kind of go around the transparent tax system.
Yeah. People
revolt over taxes more than they, keep track of the exact metallic content of their coins. So it kind of just reduces the attack surface of how much can I opaquely steal from you?
Yes.
And so then, different places are free to still kind of choose how they want to govern themselves. And there still might be pockets of authoritarianism, unfortunately, but at least that opaque part is a much less viable option.
Bitcoin isn't just a new kind of money. It's a shift in power. It challenges governments' ability to silently extract wealth through inflation and forces transparency in how societies fund themselves. In this new system, taxation must be open, spending must be accountable, and financial control starts to return to individuals and communities. As Bitcoin grows, it pressurizes centralized states to adapt or lose influence. It creates space for more localized, voluntary forms of governance, ones where people truly understand what they're agreeing to. We're watching the early stages of a global financial realignment that could reshape how civilization organizes itself. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments section below.